On each firewall that Panorama will manage, you need to configure the firewall itself with basic information about Panorama. I have two firewalls that Panorama will manage, and I need to perform the following steps on each firewall separately. So, on my Chicago firewall, I'll go to Device, Setup, Management, and under the Panorama Servers section, I'll click the gear icon to edit the settings. I'll put in the management IP address of Panorama in my environment. If I'm running a redundant pair of active-passive Panorama devices, I would put in the management IP address of the secondary Panorama host here. I don't have a secondary Panorama in my environment, so I'll just leave this field blank. I can also use host names instead of IP addresses, as long as the firewalls can resolve those host names correctly. This box for Enable Pushing Device Monitoring Data to Panorama is checked by default. And this setting instructs the firewall to send statistical information to Panorama periodically so that you can view health and performance information about this firewall in Panorama. The receive and send timeouts for connection to Panorama are set to 240 seconds by default. These values determine how long the firewall will wait before generating an error when it loses communication with Panorama. The retry count determines the number of times the firewall will attempt to connect to Panorama using an SSL connection before the connection attempt times out. Beginning with Pan OS version 10.0, this box for Enable Automated Commit Recovery is enabled by default, and this feature instructs a managed firewall to check connectivity to Panorama after Panorama has pushed down a configuration. The number of attempts and the interval between retries determines how many times the firewall will perform the check and the amount of time between each check. The default is 1 attempt and 10 seconds for the interval. If the firewall is unable to connect to Panorama, the firewall will automatically revert to a previous managed firewall. If you push down a configuration that breaks the connection between the firewall and Panorama, there is an exception to this. If you change the IP address of Panorama and push that configuration down to the firewalls, the firewall will not revert to an earlier configuration. The logic is that if you change the IP address of Panorama and then push that change down to the firewalls, you are doing that on purpose. These buttons here at the bottom let you control configuration of configuration information that Panorama would normally send down. If you click the button for Disable Panorama Policy and Objects, you are essentially telling the firewall, do not allow Panorama to manage the policies and objects on this firewall. Likewise, if you click the button for Disable Device and Network Templates, you are telling the firewall, do not allow Panorama to push the device and network components down to this firewall. It's unlikely you will need to enable either of these two settings on a production firewall, and the default behavior for a firewall is to allow Panorama to manage policies and objects, as well as device and network settings. With these settings in place, I'll click OK and then commit my changes to the firewall. And the firewall will begin attempting to connect to Panorama. I need to repeat this process on my second firewall.